Welcome to episode 73 of the MMA Rundown podcast. I'll be recapping the main event between Aleksandar Rakic and Anthony Smith, where Rakic was able to get the win and move forward in the light heavyweight division, which currently does not have a champion. I'll recap the UFC Vegas 8 card, so just go through the other 8 fights that were on the card. I believe there's 8 other fights at least. Then from there, I'll talk about the fights that are coming up next week on the card. That's going to be UFC Vegas 9, headlined by Alistair Overeem and Augusto Sakai. Next topic is going to be one that I don't think is going to get the attention that it probably should, but it's extremely exciting, especially for me as a big fan of both wrestling and jiu-jitsu. But there's an event that Flow Grappling is going to be putting on October 2nd called Who's Number One. The headliner will be Gordon Ryan and Matheus Diniz, which is a battle between two ADCC champions from last year, with Ryan winning the 99 kilogram division and Greg Jones winning the 88 kilogram, or not Greg Jones, Matheus Diniz winning the 88 kilogram division. But the match that's really interesting to me is one between Nicky Ryan, who is Gordon Ryan's younger brother, former ADCC trials winner, going up against Tony Ramos, a former NCAA Division I national champion, U.S. World Team member as well. And to win the World Team, you're effectively winning the senior level national title in freestyle wrestling. So just a fantastic wrestler himself, going in and having a jiu-jitsu match, and a straight jiu-jitsu match against Nicky Ryan. A lot of times we're seeing these matches where they're making these like half-baked rules where it's like, okay, well, it's jiu-jitsu, but no leg locks, or it's jiu-jitsu, but like takedowns are worth X many points, and like they kind of like mess it around to make it more competitive. In this case, Tony Ramos is actually going into an actual jiu-jitsu match with a guy, Nicky Ryan, who is incredibly difficult to beat, and who's also bigger than Tony Ramos is as well. So I'll be talking about that. Next thing to talk about after that will be the UFC announcing that they're going to be building a hotel near their campus. We've got Ray Borg retiring after being cut, just talking about his whole situation. An event that's going to be going on today will be Wrestling Underground. It'll be on UFC Fight Pass, headline or promoted by Chael Sonnen. So I think that in and of itself is an interesting story to talk about, just because we've seen a lot of jiu-jitsu shows sprouting up. Wrestling still has been fairly limited to the same groups that it's been with in the past. I guess it was with Fila in the past. I think Fila just rebranded to UWW, but for the most part, it's mostly just UWW and the Olympics that have been running the big wrestling events. And Full Wrestling just got involved recently, and it looks like Chael Sonnen is now starting to put on similar shows for wrestling that have been put on for jiu-jitsu. And then the last thing to talk about, and it probably should have been higher up, but I prefer not to make these podcasts too political, so if I'm going to talk politics, I either try to do it at the beginning and tell you exactly when it's going to end, or do it at the end. That way, if you don't want to hear it, then you can just cut it off right before I get started. But there were a few different UFC stories that involve politics here. One of the main ones was that Dana White spoke at the RNC, so I'll just talk about that. There was a reaction to him speaking at the RNC. Michelle Watterson had put up a comment that was just kind of like, yeah, Dana White's a great leader, at which point Angela Hill was just ripping into her and saying that she wants to beat her up because she supported Dana White for speaking at the RNC. And also Colby Covington got a lot of attention for a tweet that he put out after the NBA players boycotted as a result of the Jacob Blake shooting. So I'll be talking about that situation as well. But again, that's going to be at the end. I'll save it for the end. So if you want to hear political takes from me, then stick around for that. If you don't, I'll make sure it's just sticking to sports up until that point. So back to the start, we have Aleksandar Rakic versus Anthony Smith. This fight was kind of an odd fight. It wasn't the most exciting fight. From what I've heard from a lot of people afterwards, I feel like I disagree with what a lot of people are saying from this. A lot of people who watched this fight were like, okay, well, Aleksandar Rakic's striking is fantastic, and apparently he's a lot better on the ground than we realized, because he was just on top of and dominated Anthony Smith for the majority of a 3-round fight. As far as the striking goes, I mean, definitely give him credit for what he did there. Did a good job managing distance. Was able to land a lot of really hard leg kicks, pretty much blindly. It's not as though he was like throwing a couple punches and then setting the leg kicks up. He was just timing them really well as Smith was coming in. Those leg kicks were doing a lot of damage. It was knocking Smith down a couple different times. Was able to actually knock him down in the first round, like about a minute and a half in. And then Smith was trying to wrestle him. Rakic was able to stay on top there. And then Smith eventually ended up on bottom. And from there, Rakic, at that point, he did a good job of staying out of trouble, I guess, in that he didn't really get caught. But with that being said, it was just sort of a bizarre thing to watch, because it's not as though he was really doing a whole lot. He wasn't passing Smith's guard, and he really wasn't throwing a whole lot of strikes either. If you look at the stats on this fight, Rakic had over 12 minutes of top control time and landed 44 significant strikes, which includes 16 to the head and 7 to the body. So the other 21 leg strikes, those didn't really happen on the ground. So you're looking at, over the course of 12 minutes of control time, 23 significant strikes, and I don't know how many of those were actually standing. I'm just saying those are the amount that were to the head and the body. So it's not like he was really posturing up all that often and landing heavy ground and pound from top. He wasn't passing guard. He was just pretty much like keeping his posture low the whole time, trying to avoid submissions, and just doing enough to grind it out and win from top. So it's not as though I was really impressed by what Rakic did. Did he stay out of trouble? I guess so. It was kind of odd how Anthony Smith was attacking off of his back, because you could see like a lot of these setups coming from a mile away, especially the triangle. Smith was very successful in being able to isolate one of Rakic's arms, particularly Rakic's right arm, and hold the wrist back and create an opening for a triangle. But he would sort of inch his way towards it, and then when it actually came time to like shoot up the triangle, he would just be really sloppy about it. And it was kind of odd how he was like so tight and so deliberate all the way up until the point where it came time to shoot the triangle. And when it came time to shoot the triangle, he just didn't feel all that confident about it. Now, I guess part of it is that when he was getting close to shooting, Rakic did posture up a little bit, but it's not as though it wasn't a high enough posture where Smith couldn't attack from there. But I guess at that point, if you feel like you're going to miss the triangle and end up in a worse position, then maybe you don't feel comfortable shooting it. But even still, it was surprising for me to see Smith not do that, especially since Rakic was keeping his posture so low. It's easy when a guy is just keeping his head in your chest to get an overhook on the far side and then control the wrist on the other side, and that way with the overhook you can keep him from posturing up too high and still be able to throw a triangle up. So I was surprised that Smith didn't have more success with the triangle. As far as Smith's actual jiu-jitsu game goes, yes, he's a black belt. I don't know what areas he's strongest in. I think he's got a pretty good top game. I think that's a big part of the reason why he's made it as far as he has in jiu-jitsu. I don't know where his bottom game's at. A lot of times with these bigger guys, especially guys who were big enough to fight at like light heavyweight or heavyweight, most of the guys that they train with aren't going to be forcing them on their back all that often. So if they want to play on their back, that's oftentimes going to be their own choice. And it seems like Anthony Smith probably leans more towards playing on top than he does on bottom, and as a result, it seems as though there were some missed opportunities off of his back that other black belts may have found, but at the higher weight classes where the guys tend to work more from top than they do on bottom, sometimes this will happen. So either way, that was an issue that happened in the first round. Second round, again, they start from standing. Rakic is landing more leg kicks. Smith is trying to wrestle with him. Not terribly effective in his takedowns. Was getting thrown to the ground as well when he was trying to throw Rakic down. And again, ends up on the bottom. And similar story where Rakic is just keeping a really low posture, not really landing a whole ton of significant strikes, throwing a lot of arm punches that aren't really doing a whole lot of damage, but just killing time and winning the round. And ultimately, that was the story for the rest of the fight as well. So Rakic gets the win here. Not exactly the most impressive win for Rakic. I know a lot of people are trying to sell it like it is. He did beat Anthony Smith. Like, you got to give him credit for what he did. But it's not as though he was like throwing him to the ground, passing his guard, getting into dominant positions where he's nearing a finish, landing heavy ground and pound. Like, it was more just he was stronger than Smith. He was able to effectively defensively wrestle to keep him getting taken down. Was able to get Smith to sort of take himself down at times, which was kind of odd. Sort of toss him down, and Smith didn't seem to have the urgency at times to work his way back up. And then from there, Rakic was able to just kind of like stay on top and kill time. But with that being said, at light heavyweight, it's not as though there are a bunch of really dangerous guys who are really good at fighting off of their back. So it's not like it's one of those things where he can get away with it with Smith, but not get away with it with some other top guys. It's not like Dominic Reyes, if he gets put on his back, is going to be firing off triangles, as far as I know, at least. Blachowicz, I believe, is also a good black belt, but I think he's more of a top player as well. So it was kind of concerning, especially in the first round for Rakic, to see him just kind of like let Smith have control of his wrist for as long as he did, and not really do a whole lot about it. But ultimately, he got away with it, and it seems like with a lot of the other top guys in the division, if he gets on top, he'll be able to get away with it. So from there, it's just going to be a question of how successful is he going to be with striking against some of the top guys. With Ozdemir, he had problems and ended up losing that fight. Ozdemir was very effective with the hands and was able to check some leg kicks a lot better than Anthony Smith was. So then the question moving forward for Rakic is, if people are checking his leg kicks that aren't being set up with punches right away, what's his next option going to be? He didn't have to go to another option in this fight because Smith was just getting battered with leg kicks and was just trying to force the fight to the ground. And it sort of felt like with Smith that he was just so tired of getting leg kicked that any time he clinched up with Rakic, that particular clinch had to be the one where it went to the ground. And so at times he just wouldn't go for the best shot, and rather than just kind of like resetting, giving up, and then trying to work his way back in, he would just try to force it in a bad position as a result. So either way for Smith, not a great result for him. Takes another loss. Where he goes from here, it's sort of hard to tell. He was talking in a post-fight interview about how he feels like he was just completely undersized against Rakic, that he only has to drop a couple pounds to make light heavyweight, whereas Rakic drops like 30 pounds. And he said he really felt the strength there. It was sort of concerning that he was making strength such a big issue there. It's definitely possible that Rakic is the stronger fighter between him and Smith. But with that being said, typically within martial arts, even if you lose to a stronger guy, most people are going to look at their technique and say, well, I should have been able to overcome the strength through technique. And it was kind of odd that Smith was focusing so heavily on strength rather than the technical difficulties that he had that led to him eventually losing that fight. Because he has fought other guys who are pretty big and been able to beat them and been able to do so because his technique has been better than theirs, or at least has been good enough to create openings for his offense. And in this case, that wasn't really the case. And for him to make a much bigger deal about the size of Rakic than the fact that Rakic was able to time him coming in every time with a leg kick, or make a big deal out of the fact that Rakic was able to keep his head in his chest for most of the time on the ground, and Smith wasn't able to create openings off of that. That's a little bit worrisome for Smith, but either way, for him, where he goes from here, he was saying he either wants to take some time off and get much smaller to the point where it's easier for him to make middleweight again, or to bulk up and be a bigger light heavyweight. So there's a chance we might not see him again for the rest of the year. As for Rakic, we have the title fight coming up really soon, where it's going to be between Jan Blachowicz and Dominic Reyes. In theory, he might be able to get the loser of that fight. They also have Thiago Santos versus Glover Teixeira. It seems as though the winner of those next two fights will have the next title fight, so the winner of the Reyes versus Blachowicz fight will be the champion, and then they will have their first defense against the winner of the Thiago Santos versus Glover Teixeira fight, assuming that the winner of the Santos versus Teixeira fight isn't too heavily injured. So from there, the next logical guy would be Yuri Prochazka, who is ranked number 6 right now. It's possible that Prochazka will bump up to 5 when Smith gets bumped back, or it's possible that he'll stay at 6 and you'll just have Rakic jump ahead of him. But either way, that's a fight that would definitely make sense that they can do right now. But given the fact that the light heavyweight title fight is coming up so soon, it's also a possibility that they could just wait until that fight's over. As long as the loser isn't hurt too badly, they might give him to Rakic, or maybe even give him to Prochazka. So we'll see where they go from there. Jumping to the co-main event, we had Robbie Lawler versus Neil Magne. This fight was really hard to watch, and there are just like so many different ways to go with this, and I don't really know where to start with it. So I guess just for the fight itself, it was shocking how lackadaisical Robbie Lawler was in this fight. He really wasn't all that aggressive on the feet. He tried to initiate a takedown immediately on Magne, which is kind of odd, but I guess Magne's had trouble with guys taking him down and controlling him in the past, so maybe Lawler felt like that would have been the best path to victory for him. It didn't really work, and he ended up on his back soon after, which, again, that was also pretty surprising, because Robbie Lawler, especially when he was a champion, was really known for being incredibly difficult to take down, had a great sprawl if you try to shoot him in the middle of the cage, was really good at fighting against the fence as well. So for Neil Magne to take him down multiple times in this fight was just shocking compared to what we've seen from Lawler in the past. Oftentimes when fighters get worse over time, the grappling generally doesn't get a whole lot worse. Maybe they're a little bit slower at times, or maybe they're like so reliant on their grappling that they force it at times, and it makes it less effective. But usually it's the striking that you see issues with, whether it's the punches come a little bit slower, or maybe they're less willing to get hit, so they're less willing to throw combinations, so they're a little bit more gun shy. But to see the difficulties in grappling, for the grappling to regress the way that it has, is really surprising. And that was really on full display here. And it also seemed like there were a lot of cases when this fight went to the ground where Lawler just didn't have any urgency at all on the ground. One of the big ones for me that just completely took me off guard was when there was that twister attempt from Neil Magne. And one of the things about the twister, I guess it's more of like a general concept with back control. So the ideal back control that you want to have, if you're just learning like first day Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fundamentals, you want to have both hooks. So one hook around the left hip, one hook around the right hip. And then you want to have what's called a seatbelt grip, so one arm goes over the top of the shoulder and then one arm goes underneath the other armpit. The idea being that if you have both arms underneath both armpits, you're going to have good control, but you're not really going to be in a position to submit or really choke, because both your arms are buried underneath their armpit. If you go both over the top, you could attack for chokes with both of them, but at the same point you don't have as much control over their shoulders, and it's easier for them to kind of like roll out and create space that way. So the seatbelt's kind of like a hybrid position. If you can't get both hooks, though, what you want to look for next is something called diagonal control, which means that if you have control on one side of the hip, so if I have like a hook on the left side, or if I guess you could call it a super hook, or if I'm just like controlling the bottom hip, in this case I believe it was the left hip of Robbie Lawler, if I can control the right shoulder, I can still keep him controlled and keep him within my control there, whereas if I'm like on the same side, then it gives him space to kind of flop around and get out of there. And when he was going for that twister, he had control on the left hip. He was looking to control the right arm, which is part of the twister, because there is diagonal control involved in the twister submission itself, but there wasn't much control there. Robbie had a lot of space, and from there were a lot of different options that Robbie Lawler had to escape that position, and he really didn't do anything. He was just kind of like waiting there, and it seemed like eventually what he wanted to do was sort of like work his way back up, sort of like into that referee's position in wrestling where you're sort of turtle up, and I guess from there the turtle wasn't the most available escape, but he had a lot of other options. He's a guy who's known for having a really good butterfly guard. He could have easily rolled through, ended up bottom half rather than having his back almost taken, taken a butterfly hook from half butterfly, and then from there been able to work his way back up. But rather than that, it's like he just had it in his mind that he wanted to just work his way back up from a turtle position instead. So it's just sort of like waiting for that to open it up rather than taking what was there for him. And it just felt like he really wasn't that aggressive about getting up. It's like he just didn't seem to care all that much. It was very odd. Um, so Magne did what he had to on the feet. He was just kind of peppering with jabs, not exactly the most damaging jabs, but they were landing. They kind of hurt. They don't feel comfortable. So Magne wins this fight, completely outstrikes Robbie Lawler. Surprisingly, he's able to take him down multiple times, and Robbie's decision to pretty much force like one or two specific ways to get back up to the feet rather than taking what was available to him kept him on the ground a lot longer than he probably had to be there. So he takes a loss here, and I think from here, I hate to say it, but if this is how he's looking against Neil Magny, I don't know what's really left for Robbie Lawler. It doesn't seem like he's going to recover and get to a point where he's fighting like he used to fight and working his way back to a title. So at this point, his value to the UFC is pretty much just going to be a guy who an up-and-comer is going to build their name off of, and it seems like if he sticks around, like, who are they going to give him? Like Khamzat Chimaev and have him just get wrestle fucked by him? Like, I just don't know what the plan's going to be for Robbie. So I think at this point, retirement does make sense for him. He's a guy who's been fun to watch his entire career, but what we've seen from him currently isn't the most exciting thing, and in a way, it's kind of sad. For Magne, he did what he had to do to get the win, so you got to give him credit there. But I kind of figure him being in a similar spot in the rankings and probably fighting another ranked guy next. Another interesting thought here, and I guess I might have to explore it a little bit more in a couple weeks when Colby versus Tyron Woodley's coming up, is that one of Colby's signature wins was the win over Robbie Lawler, and a big reason why is because going in, people remembered Robbie Lawler for being that really difficult guy to take down. They remember the Johnny Hendricks fights where Hendricks had trouble taking him down and keeping him down. They remember him being a ferocious striker. So to see Colby just run through him on the feet and then take him down multiple times, it's like, oh my goodness, like this ferocious striker, Robbie Lawler, was just overwhelmed by Colby Covington and also was taken down a bunch of times by Colby Covington. Wow, how good must Colby be? And just seeing a fight like this, it sort of makes you like have to rethink it. Not to say that Colby doesn't deserve the credit that he gets for being a great fighter. Obviously, he had the fight with Kamaru Usman right after that, and it seems as though no one's really been competitive with Usman and Colby, according to one official judge. And I kind of feel the same way. Was up 3-1 heading into the fifth in that fight. So Colby's a legit fighter, but it sort of makes you think back to some of the recent fights that Robbie Lawler has had and how good you thought his opponents looked as a result. Was it that they did so well, or was it that Robbie just wasn't the same at that point and we had higher expectations and better memories of him leading into it? So I guess that's just one thing to think about. Fight before that was Ji-Yeon Kim versus Alexa Grosso. Kim was looking more for heavy shots. Grosso was just trying to stay more active, and as a result, Grosso outstruck Kim and was able to win this fight by unanimous decision. What ended up being fight of the night was Ricardo Llamas versus Bill Algio. First couple rounds were really close. I believe the second round went to Algio. The first round was pretty tight. At the time, I thought Algio might have taken it. Third round wasn't that close at all, though. It seemed like the biggest difference in this fight was definitely in the grappling. Algio was able to land a takedown at one point in this fight, but it seemed like for him, if he wasn't able to get a takedown on the first attempt, he was going to be in trouble. Llamas would kind of stay sprawled on him and then find ways to funk wrestle his way on top. Was looking for cradles at times and was successful in doing them. I was looking to hit switches at times, but for the most part, once he stuffed an initial attempt from Algio, Llamas was able to find top position, and then from there was able to land enough ground and pound to win those positions, and even in the final round was able to get to mount and end on top of mount, which was really good for him, and I think he got a 10-8 round in that final round. So as a result, he wins by unanimous decision, 29-27 on all three judges' scorecards. He's talking about potentially retiring now after this fight's over. If he does, I guess he's had a long career. It's not as though he looks like he's going to be contending for a title again. There was a time in his career when he was a title contender. He actually did fight for the title against Jose Aldo. He's not really at that level anymore. So for him, it probably doesn't make sense to keep hanging around unless he wants to just make a decent paycheck, obviously, for a lot of these fighters, especially if they're like 38 and they don't have... I guess for him, at least, he owns a gym, but I guess in a lot of other cases, if you don't own a gym, it's not as though there are easy ways to make a lot of money, especially if you didn't go to college and get a degree, but even if you did, it's not like you're going to jump into an accounting job and be able to make the same amount of money as you could make in a fight. Like, if at that point in your career, you can probably make like $50K plus for a fight, whereas if you jump into like accounting or some other professional field like that, you might make that within a year, and it's easy to see why fighters stick around when they can make money a lot quicker at that point. So that might be a thought for Llamas, that he might want to stick around a little bit longer. He did have that fight book with Ryan Hall, and maybe for him, he wants to retire on that. The assumption there would be that Ryan Hall is probably not going to give him a concussion. If he takes any damage, it's probably going to be because he doesn't tap fast enough to a heel hook. But I think for UFC standards, Ryan Hall is a relatively safe fight to take. And for Ricardo Llamas, I'm sure he's going to be able to make a decent amount of money for it. So it might make sense for him to hang around for that fight. With that being said, the Ryan Hall fight is one that really hasn't stuck for whatever reason. They've tried to make this fight multiple times and it's fallen through for multiple different reasons. So sometimes maybe you just give up on that specific matchup. But I guess for Ricardo Llamas, he's sort of in a spot where he's either thinking about retiring or maybe taking one more. But if he takes one more, the Ryan Hall fight would make sense. On the prelims, we had Impa Kasanganay versus Maki Pitolo. Impa was just longer than Pitolo for much of this fight. Was just throwing a lot of leaping hooks, a lot of hooking punches as well, and it just made it tough for Pitolo. Pitolo did have some success at times, landing some of the straighter punches, but Kasanganay was just a really difficult guy to deal with because his range was fairly long and he's very fast as well, and pretty powerful too. So that style gave issues to Pitolo, and Impa was able to get the win there. Impa still seems like he's pretty young in his career. I don't know that I see him as like a potential title challenger in the near future. I think he's definitely got a lot of time to work and has to work on his technique more, but he's one of those guys who physically is a difficult guy to deal with, and at the lower levels of the UFC, he's going to have some success. I think as he gets up in the higher levels, though, he's going to run into some real problems. But if the UFC gives him time here and doesn't force him into a fight every other week like he's asking for, then it seems like he can definitely work his way up here and potentially be an interesting prospect in a handful of years. Fight before that was Alexio de Tarico versus Zach Cummings. Relatively competitive fight in the final round, pretty much like in the final second. Zach Cummings landed a really big head kick that you could have argued would have been enough to stop the fight. Had there been more time and had he been able to follow up, he probably would have been able to get the stoppage. But either way, Cummings gets the win. We had a fight between Austin Springer and Alex Caceres. Caceres was supposed to fight Giga Chikadze, which would have been a really interesting matchup, given how good of a striker Chikadze is. But he got injured. Springer steps in and takes his spot. Springer actually fought Chikadze on the Contender Series and had beaten him. But Springer here, it looks like he got hurt by a body shot, sort of forced a takedown attempt. Caceres sprawled out of it, circled around, took the back, got both hooks in, and then just sunk in a really quick rear naked choke to get the win. So big win for Caceres, who's sort of like in the spot where he's always an exciting fighter to watch. Occasionally he gets some really big opportunities and he just doesn't take advantage of them, but then some other times he'll actually beat some guys who are really good. Had that win over Chase Hooper recently, and now has a win over Austin Springer, which will be good for him. So he's starting to build some momentum. So very exciting to see. We had a fight between Sean Brady and Christian Aguilera at welterweight. Brady is just, he's a good fighter. It's just one of those things where it's like that back tattoo is just so ugly in my eyes that it's just like I want to cheer against him just so I don't have to see him fight in the UFC anymore. But he's a good fighter. It seems like he's a decent guy, but that devil tattoo is so fucking ugly. But anyway, I guess just to really rub it in, he ends up winning by mounting a guillotine in this fight. Catches a guillotine choke. It was actually kind of surprising that he got the finish on this, because Aguilera did defend well to turn his back and eventually get to the point where his back was on the mat and Brady was off to the side of him. From there, what Aguilera would have wanted to do was to take his inside leg, which would have been his left leg, and sort of like get that knee up tight to his chest to keep from having Brady pass him out, but also if Brady tries to put his weight on him and he has his knee there, then he can extend away. And being able to extend away there definitely takes a lot of pressure off the choke. But it looks like Aguilera was more concerned about fighting the grip at that point than also fighting with his legs, and as a result, by only focusing on the grip and not focusing on the position itself, Brady was able to slide into mount, and from there finish with a one-arm guillotine choke, which is actually a relatively common guillotine finish. Some people make it seem like it's one of those things that people are just doing on the fly. It's actually a fairly common common finish that you can use, especially if you like to play with guillotines a lot. Then we have Pajanoviana versus Emily Whitmer. Whitmer forces the fight to the mat. Wasn't super successful with landing strikes from top, but Viana was able to tie her up, control her posture, and then swing her hips over, catch an armbar. The finish on was kind of odd in that it wasn't like the typical armbar finish where it straightens out. She actually kind of had it like twisted at an angle. For whatever reason, I guess Whitmer felt it was tight there and was having enough pressure on her elbow that she tapped. It seemed kind of odd that the tap came when it did, but either way, it looked like even had Whitmer been able to straighten her arm up and avoid the twisting pressure, she probably would have been still caught in that straight arm lock. So big win there for Viana. And then the first fight on the card was Mallory Martin versus Hannah Cyphers. Cyphers landed a heavy right hand in early in the first round. I think this is also Chris Tione, who had a couple fights last week where there was a big comeback, so he lets Mallory Martin fight her way out of trouble against Cyphers. It was pretty close to getting finished. But then second round, they go out there, Martin ends up on top. Cyphers just really... I don't know who she's trained jiu-jitsu with, how often she trains jiu-jitsu, but it seems like her jiu-jitsu has been a really big issue for her in her UFC career, and it really became a big issue here as well. But just defensively, what just wasn't there. Martin's able to take her back, sinking in her naked choke, and just lets out just an enormous, really awful to listen to scream after she got the win. It's a big win for Mallory Martin. For Hannah Cyphers, it seems like this is probably going to be it for her UFC career. I guess the UFC keeps other girls around who have worse records. Cyphers is now at 10-7, so maybe that's good enough for her to stick around a little bit longer. But just really haven't gotten a lot of impressive performances out of her in the UFC. So on to the next topic. It's going to be the upcoming fight card, which is UFC Vegas 9. This is going to be headlined by Alistair Overeem and Augusto Sakai. Sakai has a record of 15-1-1. Overeem 46-18. We all know who Overeem is. He's a top 10 heavyweight. Has been for quite a long time. Surprisingly, has never won the UFC heavyweight title. I guess having USADA come in has definitely worked against him. But he's a guy who, at least offensively speaking, is always going to be dangerous. Is still dangerous. Can wrestle if he has to. Has really good top control. Has good guillotine if you shoot on him and you're not careful. And just striking defensively isn't the soundest. Definitely doesn't keep his hands up as much as he should, but he definitely is very dangerous. Has very heavy kicks. Really good at landing punches. Really good in the clinch as well. So offensively, he's going to be a problem for a lot of guys. It's just the defense isn't always there for him, especially with his chin. The chin doesn't really hold up, and his defense creates opportunities for opponents to find the chin. For Sakai, got a pretty good grappling background, but he's also pretty aggressive on the feet and has had a lot of success on the feet as well. So it'll be interesting to see how he approaches this fight. If he tries to make it a grappling match with Overeem, that might actually work against him, and that Overeem's difficult to take down. Sakai can kind of burn himself out and tire himself out doing that. If he tries to make it a stand-up fight with Overeem, if he's able to use his long punches, he may be able to get past Overeem's guard, which really oftentimes isn't there or isn't really as active as it needs to be. Maybe he's able to land a big shot, but it seems like if this fight stays standing for the most part, which is what I kind of expect, Overeem on paper should have the advantage here, but again, Sakai's chin probably is going to be a lot better than Overeem's is. He's probably able to take a shot better than Overeem is. So if Sakai can take a couple shots to be able to land one, that might be enough for him to find the shot that he needs. But if I'm picking this fight, I'm picking Overeem, but Sakai is definitely a live underdog here, assuming that he is an underdog. Co-main event on this card is a fight that was supposed to be a co-main event a couple weeks ago. Ovince St. Preux versus Alonzo Menafield. Hopefully this one actually happens. As I mentioned in the preview before that fight got taken off the week of the fight, I expected OSP to be able to win this fight through the grappling, being able to take Menafield down and control him from top, and maybe even find that Von Flue choke again. I still kind of feel the same way, so we'll see if that's how the fight works out. Menafield's obviously a really big, strong guy for the weight class. A lot of good power on the feet, not necessarily the most technical striker, but when you got a guy who's in the kind of shape he's in and who has the power that he has, you really have to have a big technical advantage over him to be able to make up for that. And I would think that St. Preux is going to have that, but it's not going to be easy for him. Right before that, we have Sijara Eubanks versus Karl Rosa. Don't really have a whole lot to say about this fight. Don't know a ton about either of these girls. I guess I know a decent amount about Sijara, but don't know a whole lot about Karl Rosa. Or Karol, Karol. Fight before that is going to be a really good one. We got Michelle Pajera returning. A guy who's always fun to watch going up against Zalim Imadaev. I figure that Imadaev is going to try to make this a grappling match. But at least for as long as it stays on the feet, we're going to expect some crazy shit out of Michelle Pajera, as we usually get. There's a fight between Ricky Simone and Brian Kelleher, which I thought I heard was canceled, but I guess not. Or maybe ESPN just isn't updated on it yet. But assuming that this fight does happen, this should be a pretty fun one. Simone's one of those guys who was top 15 at one point before Faber was able to clip him, and the ref stepped in relatively quickly, but still fast enough for Faber to get the stoppage. So you'd figure here Kelleher has decent boxing, is decent on the ground, but I would imagine that Simone's going to be able to stay active enough on the feet, land some heavy shots, land some takedowns, and keep Kelleher from really catching anything. Kelleher's going to look for the guillotine whenever Simone shoots, but I think Simone will be able to avoid it and be able to get the win here. Then we got Out Moises versus Jalen Turner. Moises is coming off of a win over Michael Johnson, where he was just getting absolutely destroyed in the first round, but was able to force a takedown at the start of the second and catch a straight ankle lock on Michael Johnson, so he'll be fighting Jalen Turner. Turner should also have a pretty big advantage on him on the feet, so the question is going to be whether or not Moises can get this fight to the ground as well. If he can, he'll probably find a submission pretty quickly. If not, then Turner's probably going to pick him apart from range and get a win here. On the prelims, we have Andre Muniz versus Bartosz Fabinski. I know Muniz is a really good jiu-jitsu guy. I don't know a whole lot about Fabinski, though. Vivi Araujo versus Montana De La Rosa. Should be a pretty good fight. We've got Alexander Romanov versus Marcos Rogerio de Lima. Romanov's 11-0. I believe he's Moldovan. Marcos Rogerio de Lima has been in the heavyweight division for a little while, but has suffered a lot of pretty tough losses. Kind of surprising he's still in there, to be honest. And then we have Cole Smith versus Hunter Azure. That'll be the first fight on the card. So a lot of good fights to look forward to, and the main event will definitely be interesting. It could go a decent way in the heavyweight division, if Sakai gets the win especially, because he's relatively new blood in there. If he gets a win over Overeem, he'll probably get a pretty big opportunity right after that against a top 5 guy, and may find himself pretty close to a title fight, because they're looking for fresh guys, especially with the fact that pretty much everyone's fought Ngannou or fought Stipe at this point. So that's going to be interesting to look forward to. Next topic to talk about is going to be the Who's Number One card that's coming up in October. I think the timing on this is pretty intentional in that a lot of people signed up for Flow Grappling last year in late September for ADCC, and those signups were usually for one-year memberships, so they're making this right at the start of October, so you have to renew your membership if you want to see this. But the co-headliner that they have, and I think this is the really big one and the really interesting one, and one I think isn't going to get the same type of attention that Gordon Ryan versus Bo Nickel got, which is kind of unfortunate. But in a way, it kind of makes sense because Gordon Ryan has made a name for himself that Nicky Ryan hasn't made for himself. Gordon Ryan is a multiple-time ADCC champion. Nicky Ryan won the trials, but then was knocked off in the second round last year against Paulo Miao. So it makes sense that Nicky Ryan doesn't have the same name as Gordon Ryan. Bo Nickel won more NCAA titles than Tony Ramos did, although both are NCAA champions. So I guess to a lesser extent, this isn't quite the same type of matchup that we had with Bo and Gordon, but still, it's a very interesting matchup. And what I like about this is that with Bo and Gordon, they did do they did that really weird rule set where it was like, okay, well, it's going to be a wrestler versus jiu-jitsu, but here are some particular rules. If it goes out of bounds, it'll stand you back up, which I guess in jiu-jitsu makes sense too, but it was kind of annoying that you would see Gordon Ryan shoot in on like a flying scissor takedown and then have it like it stood back up, and then eventually Bo Nickel got wise to it and they were just sort of stalling on the feet for a while. But in this case, they're going sub only. It's going to be just straight jiu-jitsu rules, so if Nicky Ryan catches Tony Ramos in a heel hook, he catches him in a heel hook, whereas the Gordon Ryan versus Bo Nickel match, like a minute and a half in, Gordon Ryan could have finished a heel hook had he been allowed to. But according to the rules, which were made to make it more competitive, he wasn't able to. In this case, if Nicky Ryan finds a heel hook on Tony Ramos, he can finish the heel hook on Tony Ramos. And you really got to respect Tony Ramos for doing that. I'm just not a fan of these wrestling versus jiu-jitsu matches where they make the rules like these hybrid rule sets so the wrestler has a better chance or so the jiu-jitsu guy has a better chance. There's like no point to it because what does it really mean? Like, what does it mean that a wrestler beats a jiu-jitsu guy in a modified jiu-jitsu match? Like, cool, he won, but like it just doesn't mean anything. Like, if a wrestler's going to beat a jiu-jitsu guy in a jiu-jitsu match, let him beat him in an actual jiu-jitsu match. So that's the opportunity that Tony Ramos has here. On the other side of it, that means that there's going to be a lot more that Nicky Ryan can do to beat him, and it's definitely going to stack the odds in Nicky Ryan's favor. Do I think that Tony Ramos is going to win this match? Definitely not, especially since it isn't going to be based on points. So for him, even if he wanted to stall until the end and then shoot for a takedown, you'd figure that the stalling would work against him. So I think this fight's going to take place on the ground a lot, and Nicky Ryan should have the big advantage on the ground. But we don't really know a whole lot about what Tony Ramos has been able to do off of his back. I know for a fact that he has trained some jiu-jitsu before, just because there's a video of him training with Dylan Diniz from a handful of years back. But this is still a really exciting match. If you're not familiar with Tony Ramos, he's a NCAA champion for the University of Iowa. Believe he wrestled at 133 all 4 years. I don't believe he cut down to 125. I think 125 was the weight that he made for the senior level team for freestyle wrestling. But either way, national champion for Iowa, was a top guy pretty much every year that he wrestled. The years he didn't win the title, he was always in contention for it, but he finally did win the title his senior year. One of the most exciting guys at Iowa, just in general. Always had a really intense demeanor to him. Pretty much every time he would go out there, he'd come out. It was sort of like the Iowa wrestling version of Jose Aldo in a way, that he would always come out to run this town by Rihanna and Jay-Z. But always came out, would always stare down his opponents, and would always put on intense matches, which is beloved by the Hawkeye fans. Had a bit of a falling out with the Hawkeye Wrestling Club afterwards. In part, it was because in 2016 he was going for the Olympic spot, and so was Dan Dennis, who was another former Hawkeye wrestler, but Dennis had left the program for a while, and when the Olympics came around, Dennis wanted to come back and join the Hawkeye Wrestling Club and get coached by the same coaches who were coaching Tony Ramos, and since he was a former Hawkeye, the coaches accepted. And so you had pretty much the two top guys in the country at that weight class who were in the same room receiving coaching from the same people. And in the end, Diniz was able to beat him and earn the spot for the Olympic team. Tony Ramos, I believe, was on the world team either the year before or the year right after. So he could have been an Olympian. It was just that he wasn't the guy in the Olympic year. Pretty much being a world team member effectively means you're effectively like an Olympian, just not in an Olympic year. So that's the level that Tony Ramos is at. But either way, there was a bit of a falling out after that where he was upset. He felt like he was kind of betrayed and has moved on since then. He's now an assistant coach at the University of North Carolina for their wrestling program. So he's got a great background there for Nicky Ryan, as I mentioned, younger brother of Gordon Ryan. Hasn't competed a ton in the IBJJF, so that's where a lot of his big accomplishments could have come from. But he did compete in the ADCC trials, won the trials, which is big. Oftentimes in the trials, you're going to have a lot of really good black belts that are in there, and he was able to win his draw. So earned a spot in ADCC, won his first round match at ADCC against Shane Taylor, who was the 2019 Black Belt World Champion in the gi. So that's a really big win for Nicky Ryan, and then lost to Paul Miao, who's a legend. Lost a relatively close match there, but that's pretty much as he's accomplished at this point in his career. But again, he's really young, and I'm sure he's got plenty more to accomplish from here. As far as how this match goes, I kind of get the feeling, as long as guard pulls are allowed, and I don't see why they wouldn't be, I kind of get the feeling that Nicky Ryan's going to pull guard just because he's not going to take Tony Ramos down from the feet. But Nicky Ryan is known for being really good at wrestling off of his butt. So it'll be interesting to see if he tries to pull guard and see if he can like kind of sit up and go for like a single leg takedown or try to take Tony Ramos down in any form or fashion. I don't know that I see him being successful with it, but I see him definitely trying that. But if he's unsuccessful with that, then I think at that point he's going to be attacking at the legs, and Ramos is going to be on the outside, sort of trying to pick his spots, when to get in and when not to. But eventually Ryan's probably going to catch him and be able to finish him from there. As far as the main event goes, between Gordon Ryan and Matheus Diniz, as I mentioned before, this is a matchup between two ADCC champions, 88 kilogram champion with Matheus Diniz, and then 99 kilogram champion with Gordon Ryan. I would imagine that Gordon should have the edge here. Diniz is still a very difficult guy to deal with. Diniz won the title by beating Craig Jones in the finals at 88 kilograms. So Craig Jones is known largely for his leg lock game, and it's very difficult to deal with from there. But Jones has also kind of had some holes in his wrestling, and that was what put him behind and allowed Diniz to get on top. Diniz is really good top pressure. Very heavy, very difficult to get underneath and to sweep over. So for Gordon Ryan, if Ryan ends up on bottom, you would figure he'll have some difficulty in getting underneath Diniz and trying to create some sweeps or trying to create some opportunities. But again, Gordon Ryan's really good at what he does. In theory, Bouchesh is also very difficult to sweep, and he was able to sweep him. So it'll be interesting to see if he can set up his usual butterfly guard setup, where he's able to trap the arm and sweep over the side. If he's able to just kind of elevate and try to get in on Matheus Diniz's legs, it'll be interesting to see if that's how he fights. If he fights off his back, or if he just tries to wrestle here. I know that John Danaher is talking a lot about how he's focusing a lot on wrestling right now, and maybe this is an opportunity where Gordon Ryan feels like he's the bigger guy anyway, that he can try to wrestle Diniz down, get on top of Matheus, and then look to pass his guard and take his back from there. But either way, it should be a pretty fun match. Gordon Ryan's going to be the bigger guy. He's definitely going to be the favorite here, but it's going to be a pretty fun match that I don't think has happened quite yet. Craig Jones will also be on the card, but they haven't announced he'll be going up against yet. That announcement should be coming tomorrow, but just the main and the co-main right now are good enough for me to renew my membership and want to tune in. Next thing to talk about is going to the UFC putting up a hotel in Vegas. It's an interesting move to me because I'm not exactly sure what the long-term goal on that is, because by the time it's eventually up, you would figure that most of these COVID restrictions are going to be gone. In the meantime, it makes sense now that they can have a hotel and have control of that, and they can sort of like institute their own bubble, which it seems like has been an issue for them. They've had a few fights that have fallen off because of positive COVID tests, whether it's been that OSP fight that's going to be coming back next week. Really surprising, and I probably should have mentioned it before. We were supposed to get Magomed Ankalaev and Ian Kutalaba, and that fight fell through because Kutalaba tested positive for COVID a second time. Again, I'm very curious every time that someone gets pulled off of a card for a positive test, whether it's for themselves or for a cornerman, but especially if it's for themselves and it's late in fight week where they've already been effectively on campus, so to speak, with the UFC for the past couple of days. It'd be interesting if they could kind of like run B samples on these things and really confirm that there are positive tests, especially for Kutalaba, who tested positive fairly recently, because it seems like this would be really big news, not just within the UFC world, but also like in the general world, that a guy like Kutalaba tests positive, gets over it, and then tests positive again like a month after. I think it's been less than a month. So that does seem kind of odd, but maybe for the UFC they feel like they can keep better control of that. At least if they had control of a hotel right now. But once things go back to normal, having a UFC hotel, what benefit does it really offer? I guess they can offer better amenities to their fighters when they come into Vegas. Obviously, the UFC is based out of Vegas, and they're going to have a lot of cards in Vegas regardless. Even when they're back on the road and traveling around city to city, they still come back to Vegas multiple times a year. Plus, they have the Tuesday Night Contender Series thing, so it does make sense for them to want to help out with that, but just doesn't... For me, as far as the business expense goes, it's going to be expensive to build a hotel. It's going to be expensive to run a hotel. If they're just doing it for UFC purposes, it seems like that's going to be a pretty heavy expense that isn't necessarily going to have a huge return on investment. So then from there, the question then becomes, are they going to like also have just regular people go to this hotel? Like, I don't think it's going to be based on the Strip. Like, most people who are going to Vegas and who are staying at hotels are probably trying to stay on the Strip. I guess you can stay off the Strip, too. There are nice hotels in Henderson that people stay at, too. So is the UFC hotel going to be, like, something that just regular people like you and I can go to and just hang out at when we're in Vegas and kind of get, like, a really cool fan experience? Maybe that's going to be part of the plan, too. You would figure so, because they're going to have to find some other ways to make money off of this thing. So at this point right now, they're mostly just talking about it from a real estate standpoint, that they bought the real estate for it, and that's what they're planning to do with it. But I am going to be interested to see what actually happens when they go ahead and build this thing. What it's going to mean for the fighters, who are now likely going to be staying there instead of just at a random hotel in Vegas, and then also what it could potentially mean for just regular fans who may have some options at staying at a UFC hotel, and whether or not that's the type of thing you want to do when you're going out to Vegas. But it's definitely something that's going to be interesting to pay attention to. We're really early in the process right now, but I think over time there are going to be some interesting stories that pop out of that. Next topic is going to be Ray Borg. So he was cut a few weeks ago. I think I mentioned that at the time that he was cut. And at the time, he pretty much said, like, look, I'm going to have to, like, reconsider what I want to do with my career right now. Like, I'm still pretty young. I think he's 27 at this point. He's had some issues with his kids. So for him, being in the UFC makes sense because he can make pretty good money and still be able to take care of his kids. But if he's fighting, like, at an LFA and making $5,000 a fight, that's going to make things a lot more difficult for him. So I guess for him, he put some thought into it and realized that the money that he can make on the regional scene, whether it's like an LFA or maybe he put some feelers out to Bellator, and Bellator didn't really offer much for him. I guess he just feels like the opportunities just aren't there for him at this point, and if he's not in the UFC, then he kind of has to look elsewhere. So it seems like the plan for him is going to be to retire. It's definitely possible, especially with him, who's known more for his grappling than his striking, that he might be able to take some competitive jiu-jitsu matches every so often as well, to stay active and earn a few extra bucks. But it does seem like that his plan right now is to retire. But at 27, you'd hope that he keeps training anyway, just because he enjoys doing it, and maybe things sort of start to level out for him. He's able to make another run in MMA and actually work his way back into the UFC, because he does have plenty of time to work with. And it's not as though he's like taking a ton of damage where it's like, oh, he's just a shot fighter. It seems like he's got more to give, but at this point, it seems like at least for the next few years, we're probably not going to be seeing Ray Borg anytime soon unless it's in a jiu-jitsu competition. Next topic to talk about is Wrestling Underground. That'll be premiering this weekend. So the main event for this card is going to be Nick Gwiazdowski versus Kyvan Gadsden. Battle between two guys who are in two different weight classes. So Gwiazdowski's in heavyweight, which is 125 kilograms in Olympic wrestling. Kyvan's at 97 kilograms, which is the weight class right underneath it. I don't believe that Gwiazdowski's like a full 125 kilograms, but I don't believe he like maxes out the weight class. Gadsden's relatively big for his weight class too, so it's not like these guys are completely mismatched in size. But Gwiazdowski, multiple-time world team member for Team USA, best guy in the country, whereas Gadsden has been behind Kyle Snyder, which makes sense because Kyle Snyder's had a fantastic senior career. Now, Gadsden did have a time in college where he wrestled Kyle Snyder when I think Gadsden was a senior and Snyder was a freshman. He actually was able to pin him in the NCAA championships. And that's sort of been like the defining moment for him, both in that he won a national champion, but that he was able to beat Kyle Snyder in the process of doing so. But it seems like ever since then, he's sort of been like the number 2 guy in the country at 97 kilograms, but like a distant number 2 away from Kyle Snyder. Whereas Gadsden's had a couple matches with Snyder that have been really competitive, or Gwiazdowski has had matches with Snyder that's been competitive. I don't think Gwiz has ever beaten Snyder, but they've been closer than what we've seen from Gadsden and Snyder recently, ever since that pin in college. So the match itself should be pretty interesting, but I think the bigger story here is that we're starting to see promoters like Chael and like Flow Wrestling, who are looking at putting on like these super fight shows like what we see in jiu-jitsu all the time now. They're looking to put those on for wrestling. As far as what I think about the business model, I don't necessarily love the business model. Not that I really love the show business model for jiu-jitsu either. It seems like for the companies that are having some success doing that, a lot of times it's because they're getting good streaming contracts. It's not as though they're making like a ton of money on the gate. So Fight to Win makes pretty good money off of Flow Grappling. Flow Grappling pays them a good amount for every event they put on, so they're guaranteed a pretty good income. Third Coast Grappling, I think, same type of situation. For who's number one, these events are put on by Flow itself, so Flow's already paying for it. So for them, they're not just looking at it like we're trying to make money on the event so much as they're looking at it as like a content play as well, where they're developing their own content. So for them, it's a little bit different. For Chael, I know he gets paid by Fight Pass. I don't know that he makes a whole ton on it. We remember EBI, which is one of the early grappling events on Fight Pass, but Eddie would pretty much tell you himself, like, look, he's just barely breaking even on a lot of these things. And there weren't even like massive payouts. Like at worst, you'd have to pay $20,000 to the winner, and then obviously he's also paying expenses to fly everyone out as well. But still, it just seems like it's sort of a tough business model to have. I still think that for grappling, because it's something that can be done as often as it can be, you would probably want to copy more of a tennis model than like a UFC model. Like the UFC model makes sense in that a fighter's only going to fight like 3 or 4 times a year, so you have to make each individual fight like a really big deal, and it makes sense to like do these super fight cards. But in tennis, for example, like you could have Federer and Djokovic play each other like 10 times a year, and it's not a big deal. So like trying to be like, oh, this is the super match between Federer and Djokovic. Like you don't have to really do that. Whereas in the UFC, you can't like run John Jones versus Daniel Cormier 10 times. So like the couple times they fight, it's like, okay, well here it is. Like here's the big fight. So that makes sense within the context of MMA or boxing. But for wrestling or jiu-jitsu, where they can compete multiple times within a weekend and compete hundreds of times a year, I still feel like the tournament set is probably the best route to go. But it seems like we are seeing some of these events being put on for wrestling now, assuming that they can make enough money on streaming rights, where even if the gate isn't all that successful for them, they can still turn a profit. You're probably going to see more of it, but it is interesting to see that Chael Sonnen is now moving into wrestling. That's definitely his first passion, and I'm definitely hoping for the best here because it would be cool to see wrestlers get more opportunities to make money in wrestling. But I'm just not sure that this is the best approach to go for it. And we have seen some shows in the past where they've done pay-per-views that haven't been successful, but maybe the answer is to have the Flow Grapplings of the world and have the UFC Fight Passes of the world pay you just enough where you're able to turn a profit, just putting these super fight shows together. Last topic to talk about is what I mentioned before. It's going to be the more political topic. So again, if you're not interested, now would be the end of the podcast. And I guess at this point, I'll just sort of run through what effectively is like the end credits and just say, okay, well, next week we'll be recapping UFC Vegas 9, which is the Overeem versus Sakai card, previewing the fight that'll be coming up after that, and talking about anything else that comes up throughout the week. If you still want to stick around, then I've got some talk on Dana White's speech at the RNC, Angela Hill versus Michelle Watterson and their little spat, and then also talking about Colby Covington having a really viral tweet about the players who decided not to play in the NBA, MLB, NHL, and other leagues in the middle of the week. So I'll start on that now. So Dana White, first off, decided to speak at the RNC again. He spoke in 2016. The speech that he had in 2016 was a lot different than the one he had now. The one in 2016 was relatively apolitical for a political convention. It's pretty much just him saying, like, look, when I was young and in the UFC, like when we were a young company and we were just trying to like gain a footing, he helped us out with his properties, helped us put on events, was very kind to me at the time. So he's a nice guy. I like him, and he's a fighter. Like that was effectively the speech. It wasn't like, well, here are some policies that are like, here's why you shouldn't vote Democrat. It's just like, I like Donald Trump. He was good to me. He's a nice guy. He's cool. Like that's pretty much the extent of the 2016 speech. This speech was definitely more political from Dana White. I guess for him, he was pretty tired of a lot of the bullshit that he had to deal with the coronavirus, especially what happened in California when the UFC 249 card had to get rescheduled. So for him, he was talking about how Donald Trump was really supportive of all the leagues getting back and all the sports coming back, how he worked with Dana White, how he involved Dana White in the process, how he offered his support. And then from there, we're starting to talk about how the coronavirus has really shown that a lot of leaders are inept, and that it's important not just to vote for the president, but also to vote for local leaders, because a lot of these local leaders have a lot of power and are making a lot of issues, and pretty much saying that you should vote Republican down ballot, not just for Trump, but also for some of the local leaders like governors, so you don't have a situation like what happened with Newsom, mayors, and smaller governments as well. So this was definitely a lot more political from Dana White than the first one was, because he actually was like saying, here's who you should vote for and why, and getting onto some more political topics. But again, it's sort of odd. Like I generally prefer politics to be kept out of sports. UFC is a little bit different, and I brought this up too with, I think it was Devin Clark who was kneeling after the George Floyd thing, where I said that I actually was okay with that, with the main reason being that it's not as though he was like kneeling through a national anthem or like disrespecting what's supposed to be anything, that it's like a unifying song or unifying moment. He's just kind of doing it on his own, and in the world of MMA, it's sort of like WWE, where you're kind of like building a character for yourself, and if you're going to be the guy who kneels in the octagon, then there are going to be some people who love that, and that gives them reason to like you, and there are going to be people who hate it, and it gives people who want to watch you and have reason to care about what happens in your fight. So I guess in MMA it's a little bit different in that I'm a little bit more open to politics. It's not as though Dana White is replaying this speech on UFC platforms, so making sure that people who are trying to watch the UFC have to watch that. He's kind of doing it on a separate platform, so I guess that's okay. But effectively it is what it is. I don't know that's going to make things any easier for him. A lot of people who hate him in the first place are going to really try to get after him now. There are some people trying to put hit pieces on him and saying that he constantly underpays his fighters, because it seems like that's always the approach that people go for. I've talked about that a million times. I don't see any reason to bring it up right now. Just not like there's anything new to talk about. But other than that, it seems as though it was a pretty popular speech, at least on the right. I think a lot of people enjoyed it. Even people who don't really follow the UFC, they felt like it was a pretty good speech. President Trump retweeted the speech itself, and just had people watch the whole thing. So it seems like he was pretty happy with how it went. So that's pretty much where it goes from there. Before he spoke, he was being asked about it after a Tuesday Night Contender Series in the post-fight press conference for that. I was just saying that he's not concerned about doing it. One of the questions was like, "Don't you feel like in a time as divisive as this that it's a bad time to speak?" And he's like, "I don't give a shit. Like I'm perfectly fine speaking here." And there was a comment on an Instagram post that shared that video by Michelle Watterson, which was like, "I appreciate Dana White as like Dana White's a great leader. I really appreciate him." And it was just kind of like that. It's not as though she was like saying that she supports Donald Trump or anything like that. It was more just I support Dana in response to Dana saying that he has no problem speaking at the RNC. At which point Angela Hill was like, "Well, I can't wait to punch you in the face," or something like that, which is, I mean, I guess it makes sense. I think we pretty much all know if we follow Angela Hill on social media, or if we don't follow her on social media, but people we follow do. She's definitely very open about the fact that she leans left. So for her to go after Michelle Watterson for supporting Dana White for supporting a right-wing president, I guess that isn't the most surprising thing. But a lot of people online were making a big deal out of it. Someone like, "Oh my God, I can't believe Michelle Watterson would say what she said," which was really innocuous. It's not even though she said anything political. She's just like, "I support Dana White." Now, granted, it was on a post that was related to Dana White speaking at the RNC, but even still, it's not as though Michelle said was particularly political. But either way, a lot of people were upset with her for that, and felt as though like Angela Hill like did something awesome by saying that she was going to punch Michelle Watterson in the face for saying that. I don't know if those two are signed up to fight at any point soon, but it seems like there's some weird heat about that. And then the last thing to mention is just Colby Covington putting up a tweet that effectively. So I guess I'll tell the story first, just in case you aren't aware of it. So, especially if you're not from America, because when I look at the analytics on here, a lot of people who listen to this aren't from the USA. So the USA is sort of in a weird spot right now, at least from a racial tension standpoint, where there is one side of the aisle that is pushing this idea that if you are black in America, then everyone's out to get you pretty much, and just life isn't good for you. Cops are constantly trying to kill you, and occasionally they'll find some stories where they feel like it sort of pushes that, and they'll really bring those stories to the forefront, whether it's Brianna Taylor, George Floyd, and now this Jacob Blake situation in Kenosha. So each of those situations is their own thing. Brianna Taylor, she was living with her boyfriend who was being watched for, who was a drug dealer and was being watched, and a SWAT team came in and performed. I think actually it wasn't a SWAT team. I think it was the police that were acting like a SWAT team. But they came in, supposedly performed a no-knock warrant, but I think they actually did knock beforehand. When they tried to bust through the door, the official story is that the boyfriend started shooting at them, or started shooting at the cops. The cops shot back, and then caught in the crossfire was Brianna, who took 5 shots. The boyfriend didn't take any shots, but Brianna, from taking those 5 shots, ended up dying. And so the idea was like, well, it's a no-knock warrant. She didn't do anything, and she got killed by police. So this is like a massive injustice. So that's one of the stories that they talk about. The George Floyd one was the one that I think everyone's seen at this point, where apparently the context behind why the officers were sitting on for so long was revealed recently in a body cam footage. But apparently the footage showed that he was obviously really high. Fentanyl is what they found in the system afterwards. They were trying to put him in the cop car, and they were relatively peaceful with him up until that point, and he just refused to go in the cop car. They even like offered to roll the windows down so he'd be more comfortable in there. So then at that point, he like asked to like just stay on the concrete and stay outside. So they decided to call an ambulance over to get him taken care of. And then while they were waiting, that's when they decided they had to like keep him in place until the ambulance came. And a few of the cops were doing a decent job of keeping him in place. But then you had Chauvin, who was the cop who kept his knee on his neck the entire time, which was completely unnecessary. And it looks as though he had put him unconscious with the pressure from the knee on the neck, and ultimately that's what caused the death there. So that there was just no reason for the knee to be on the neck, especially for that long. So there was a lot of outrage over that. But the most recent case was with Jacob Blake, who apparently had a warrant out for his arrest for sexual assault. Cops were called. Apparently they had control of him on the ground at one point. He was able to get up, starts walking around to the other side of the car where he was being taken. The cops have their guns out and are like yelling at him. He just keeps walking and just ignoring them the whole way through. Opens up the car door, and it's not as though he was like getting in the car door and just trying to like sit down and like start driving away. Like he's like gets in the car and just starts reaching for something. So at that point, the cops are assuming, okay, well he's reaching for a weapon. Some photos look as though he was holding a knife before he even got in the car. From what we heard now, that a knife was found on the floorboards. We don't know if that's the knife he already had and he dropped it after he got shot, or what the deal is. But he was just ignoring the cops who had guns pointed at him. Was reaching for something in his car, and at that point he was shot 7 times in the back. From there were some people who had issues with the number 7. I don't know whether or not that's like within police protocol. I know the idea is that once you actually are going to open fire on someone, the idea is to fire until they're neutralized. It's not as though you take a shot, ask them, hey, are you okay? Are you going to stop fighting? And if they say no, then you shoot again. Like once once it's time to actually start shooting, you're considering your life at danger. You're considering the situation to be highly volatile, so you're going to keep shooting until they're stopped. So I don't know whether or not 7 was like would be considered excessive under how they're trained. But either way, that's the video that we saw. Surprisingly, Blake actually did survive. He's just paralyzed because I'm sure he got hit in the spine with at least one of those bullets. But there was a lot of issues with that. That happened on Sunday. Apparently, sports went on for a couple days, and then on Wednesday, George Hill, the Milwaukee Bucks, the basketball team decided that he didn't feel comfortable playing. A couple of his teammates supported him, and then from there, the full team decided that they were not going to play. And then from there, that just created a situation where a bunch of other people decided to play copycat and decided they weren't going to play either. And just thinking about it doesn't really make any sense because it's not as though the NBA had anything to do with Jacob Blake getting shot in the first place. It's not as though the NHL had anything to do with it. It's not as though any of these sports leagues did. So really boycotting the sport is not going to do anything to help. If the idea is that we're not going to give the fans something that they can watch and enjoy because they have to focus on more important things, also weird move because it's pretty obvious that a lot of these BLM protesters or people who are supportive of the BLM movement would like for you to vote Democrat, which is kind of odd given that a lot of these problems seem to be happening in Democrat cities. But it's kind of funny given the timing that they decided not to play on Wednesday or Thursday at the same time the RNC was going on. So I guess if the idea was that you weren't going to watch sports and you were going to focus on what's going on in the world instead, you'd be watching the RNC or you'd be watching the DNC. So I guess that means that people who otherwise would have been watching the NBA Finals, or not the NBA Finals, the NBA playoffs, would instead be watching Dana White speaking at the RNC. But it's not as though this was very well thought out. But a lot of people were upset about the fact that they did that. They felt like it was just virtue signaling that they weren't actually doing anything to accomplish anything. It just wasn't really a smart move at all. Colby Covington was among them. He put up a tweet pretty much just saying, like, hey, all you lazy-ass millionaires, like, instead of just, like, skipping a couple days of playing, how about you really show that you care. You quit your $1 million jobs and you actually take up a hard job like being a cop and help out that way. And I think to this point that tweet's got over 90,000 likes, which is a ton for anyone in the MMA space. I think only Conor McGregor is the guy who like hits those numbers or hits higher pretty frequently. So it seems as though he drew a lot of attention for himself from outside of the MMA world. Sort of unfortunate that this happened a couple weeks before his fight, I guess. If you're really trying to be opportunistic, he could have had a fight. He does have the fight with Tyron Woodley, which is... It could definitely have a political storyline to it. We know where Colby Covington stands. We know where Tyron Woodley stands. We've got this issue going on right now. I don't know whether or not this is going to be a main issue in the news in a couple weeks from now, just because it seems as though it doesn't take a while for something new to come up and to draw everyone's attention away. But if it is, it could potentially draw a lot more eyes to that Colby versus Tyron fight. But we're still like three weeks away from that fight. I'm not sure if this is going to lead to some momentum where we're going to get really big ratings on it, but it's still something I felt was worth mentioning. So that covers it for this week. Already mentioned before what we'll be covering next week, so that covers that. So I'll get back to you guys next week, and hopefully we've got a lot to talk about then.